Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to dive right into a genuinely fascinating conversation that sits directly at the intersection of history, ancient texts, and deeply held beliefs. We're unpacking Bart D. Ehrman's highly provocative 2014 book, How Jesus Became God. Now, when this book hit the shelves, it didn't just quietly enter the academic world. No, it ignited a massive, fiery debate across both scholarly circles and the general public. As we go through this, our goal isn't to validate or debunk anyone's personal theology. Instead, we're going to look closely at the historical arguments Ehrman makes and the immense pushback those arguments received.
It really all begins with this one simple but incredibly explosive question. Did the historical Jesus actually claim to be God? This inquiry serves as the starting point for our scholarly detective story today. Now, for billions of people around the world, the answer to this is a fundamental given. But Ehrman approaches this from a completely different angle. He's looking at it not from the pulpit, but from the historian's desk. He wants to know what the earliest possible records, completely stripped of centuries of later interpretation, actually tell us about the man from Galilee.
And well, that leads us to Ehrman's incredibly bold core thesis. He argues that the widely held Christian doctrine of Jesus as the second person of the Trinity actually developed long after his crucifixion. According to Ehrman, during his actual lifetime, Jesus absolutely did not walk around claiming to be divine, and his immediate followers didn't worship him as God while he was alive. It's a premise that completely flips the traditional script. It suggests that the divinity of Jesus was a belief that evolved over time, rather than a hard fact established at the very beginning of his ministry.
Section 1. The lens, history versus theology. Let's take a look at the very specific framework the author uses to examine these ancient texts. Understanding this distinction is absolutely crucial. When speaking to Terry Gross on NPR's Fresh Air, Ehrman made a really important clarification. He said he isn't actually attempting to answer if Jesus was literally God or if he was actually raised from the dead. He just leaves those open. Why? Because to him, those are purely theological questions. As a historian, his only job is to trace the historical belief itself. He's tracking the paper trail of human ideas, not trying to prove or disprove the supernatural.
Section 2. Tracing the divine doctrine. Let's map out exactly how Ehrman argues this timeline unfolded. How do we get from a first-century preacher to a global religion centered on a divine figure? Well, according to this timeline, it was a very slow evolution over hundreds of years. In the first century, during his lifetime, Ehrman argues we just have the exaltation of a Jewish preacher. It's only in the years directly following the crucifixion that the initial belief in his divinity begins to spark and take root. Then it takes the following centuries for the concept of the Trinity to become a fully fleshed-out official church doctrine. He meticulously uses citations from the Gospels and the Epistles to try and prove this gradual elevation of status. Which brings us to a highly specific theological term, prosopon. This refers to the second divine person, an incarnation of God within the Trinity. Basically, Ehrman is arguing that Jesus never claimed to be this specific divine entity during his earthly ministry. The idea of God the Son as an equal and co-eternal part of a Holy Trinity is, according to his book, a framework constructed by much later generations of followers, not a title ever claimed by the historical figure himself.
Section 3. Scholarly and popular reception. Let's talk about the reaction, because it was intense. As you might imagine, a book drawing these kinds of conclusions got wildly diverse reactions, depending entirely on who was reading it. Reviewer John Moravsky in the Charlotte Observer pointed out a really striking contrast. To your casual, everyday modern churchgoer, Ehrman's claims might seem completely shocking and entirely unorthodox. But if you were a theologian debating back in the 4th century, you'd be right at home. These exact disagreements were raging centuries ago. Moravsky also points out that while critics are super quick to highlight Bible verses where Jesus seems to claim divinity, Ehrman's historical method handles those by categorizing them as later embellishments rather than actual historical quotes. Now, obviously, critics are going to push back hard on a historian dismissing certain Bible verses, but Moravsky does acknowledge a basic historical logic here. As he puts it, he's personally yet to meet a Christian who believes Jesus walked around Galilee declaring, "I'm the second person of the Trinity." The highly specific, structured language of later church councils just wasn't the everyday language of first-century Galilee. So what did the broader academic community think? Scholar Larry W. Hurtado offered a pretty mixed review in the Christian Century. He pointed out that for New Testament scholars, honestly, none of this is actually new. This academic debate has been happening for a long, long time.
Now, Hurtado does praise Ehrman for making really complex scholarly arguments accessible to everyday readers, but he also argues that the book actively seeks to stir the pot and create controversy among Christians, agnostics, and skeptics alike. He cautions that in aiming for that popular audience, Ehrman occasionally oversimplifies the material and presents arguments that come off as a bit one-sided.
Section 4. The organized pushback. The controversy definitely didn't stop at just a few mixed newspaper reviews. Get this. In one of those incredibly rare publishing phenomena, we saw a highly coordinated counter-argument play out in real time. On the exact same day that Harper One published Ehrman's book, Zondervan, which is actually a Christian imprint of the very same parent company, simultaneously published a responding book. It was titled, How God Became Jesus, The Real Origins of Belief in Jesus' Divine Nature. It was a literal, coordinated effort to combat Ehrman's historical claims with a robust theological defense right out of the gate.
Well, Ehrman didn't just let that slide. Firing back on his blog, he basically synthesized the entire debate by hammering on that fundamental split we talked about earlier. He argued that his critics in the responding book were not arguing from a place of neutral historical evidence. Instead, they were operating fundamentally from their own religious beliefs and theological assumptions. For Ehrman, if you start with the theological assumption that Jesus is God, you're no longer doing strict history.
But, the academic pushback was also highly specific, and sometimes it got pretty personal for the scholars involved. Take Charles Gieshin, for example. He publicly objected to how his own research was utilized in Ehrman's book. Gieshin contested how his work was used to support Ehrman's secular timeline, arguing that actually his research points to a conclusion where Jesus is directly identified with the God of Israel. It's wild. It just goes to show how two incredibly smart scholars can look at the exact same ancient texts and, depending entirely on their methodology, arrive at radically different conclusions. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we want to leave you with one final, absolutely vital question to chew on. How does separating history from theology fundamentally change the way we read ancient texts? Whether you find yourself completely agreeing with Ehrman's conclusions or siding strongly with his critics, this debate really highlights why this matters. The lens we choose, whether we read a text hunting for historical data or searching for theological truth, completely shapes the history we uncover. It forces us to ask ourselves what we're really looking for when we stare into the past. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking those big questions.